The cold winter wind blew across the quiet cemetery, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The sky was overcast, and the gray clouds seemed to mirror the sorrow that hung in the air. Among the rows of weathered tombstones, an elderly woman sat hunched on a small wooden stool, her frail frame wrapped in a tattered shawl. Her name was Margaret, and she had been visiting her husband's grave every single day for the past 5 years since his passing. Margaret's hands trembled as she placed a single white rose on the grave. Her husband, Thomas, had been her rock, her best friend, and the love of her life. Without him, the world felt empty, and she struggled to find meaning in her days. She whispered softly to the grave, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I miss you, Thomas. Every day feels harder than the last." Unbeknownst to Margaret, a man stood a few feet away, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He was dressed in an expensive tailored coat, his polished shoes gleaming despite the muddy ground. His name was Alexander Grant, a self-made billionaire known for his ruthless business tactics and cold demeanor. But today, something about the old woman's quiet grief stirred something deep within him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Alexander hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said gently, his voice softer than usual. "Are you all right?" Margaret looked up, startled by the stranger's presence. Her eyes, though filled with sadness, held a quiet strength. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, though her voice betrayed her words. Alexander knelt beside her, his expensive coat brushing against the damp grass. "I couldn't help but notice you've been here for a while. Is there anything I can do to help?" Margaret shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "No, dear, but thank you for asking. I come here to talk to my husband. It's the only place where I feel close to him." Alexander's heart ached at her words. He had spent years building an empire, but in that moment he realized how little he truly understood about love and loss. "Would you mind if I sat with you for a while?" he asked, surprising even himself. Margaret nodded, and the two sat in silence, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a connection, not to money or power, but to another human being. As the minutes passed, the silence between Margaret and Alexander grew comfortable, almost soothing. Margaret glanced at the well-dressed man beside her, curiosity flickering in her tired eyes. "You don't seem like the kind of person who spends much time in cemeteries," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of warmth. Alexander chuckled, a rare sound for him. "You're right, I don't. But something about seeing you here, it made me stop. I don't know why." Margaret nodded, as if she understood. "Sometimes the heart knows what the mind can't explain. Tell me, young man, do you have someone you've lost?" The question caught Alexander off guard. He hesitated, his mind drifting to memories he had long buried. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "My parents. They passed away when I was very young. I don't remember much about them, but I remember the loneliness that followed." Margaret reached out and gently patted his hand. "I'm sorry to hear that. Loss is a heavy burden to carry, especially when you're young." Alexander looked down at her hand, weathered by time but still gentle. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you keep going after losing someone you love?" Margaret sighed, her gaze returning to the grave. "It's not easy. Some days it feels like the pain will never go away. But I've learned to hold on to the memories, the love we shared. That's what keeps me going. Thomas was my everything, but he wouldn't want me to stop living because he's gone." Alexander listened intently, her words stirring something deep within him. He had spent his life chasing success, building walls around his heart to avoid getting hurt, but sitting there with Margaret, he realized how empty his life had become. "Tell me about him," Alexander said suddenly. "About Thomas." A faint smile touched Margaret's lips as she began to speak. "Thomas was the kindest man I've ever known. He had a heart of gold and a smile that could light up a room. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. He worked as a carpenter, and I was a schoolteacher. Life was simple, but it was beautiful." As Margaret shared stories of her life with Thomas, Alexander found himself captivated. He laughed at her tales of their silly arguments and felt a lump in his throat when she spoke of Thomas's unwavering support during her darkest days. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a connection to someone else's pain and their joy. "You were lucky to have him," Alexander said when she finished. "Not everyone finds a love like that." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was. And I'm grateful for every moment we had. But now, I'm alone. My children live far away, and I don't want to be a burden to them." Alexander's heart ached at her words. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're someone who deserves to be cared for, just like you cared for Thomas." Margaret smiled, though her eyes were sad. "You're kind to say that, dear, but the world doesn't always work that way." Alexander frowned, a determination growing within him. He didn't know what he could do to help Margaret, but he knew he couldn't just walk away, not after hearing her story, not after feeling the weight of her loneliness. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the cemetery, Alexander realized how much time had passed. He had spent hours listening to Margaret's stories, and yet it felt like no time at all. He stood up, brushing the dirt off his coat, and extended a hand to help Margaret to her feet. "Let me walk you home," he offered, his tone gentle but firm. Margaret hesitated, her eyes widening in surprise. "Oh, no, dear. You've already done so much by sitting with me. I couldn't possibly trouble you further." Alexander shook his head. "It's no trouble. Please, let me make sure you get home safely." Margaret finally nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "All right, if you insist. Thank you, Alexander." As they walked slowly through the cemetery and into the quiet streets of the small town, Alexander couldn't help but notice how frail Margaret seemed. Her steps were slow and deliberate, and she leaned heavily on her cane. He wondered how she managed to make the trip to the cemetery every day, especially in the cold winter weather. "Do you live far from here?" Alexander asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not too far," Margaret replied. "Just a few blocks away. I've lived in the same house for over 50 years. It's full of memories, but it's also a bit too big for me now." Alexander nodded, his mind racing. He had seen enough to know that Margaret's life was far from easy. Her clothes were worn, her shoes were old, and her home, when they finally reached it, was in desperate need of repair. The once charming house now had peeling paint, a sagging roof, and a garden overrun with weeds. Margaret noticed him taking it all in and sighed. "I know it's not much, but it's home. Thomas and I worked so hard to make it ours. I just wish I could keep it up the way he used to." Alexander's heart ached for her. He had the means to fix everything, her house, her life, even her loneliness. But he didn't want to overwhelm her or make her feel like a charity case. He needed to approach this carefully. "Margaret," he said as they reached her front door, "would you mind if I came by tomorrow? I'd like to help you with a few things around the house, if that's all right." Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You've already done so much by listening to me today. I couldn't possibly ask for more." "You're not asking," Alexander said with a small smile. "I'm offering. Please, let me help." Margaret studied him for a moment, as if trying to figure out his motives. Finally, she nodded. "All right, dear, if it means that much to you, I won't say no." "Thank you." Alexander left her with a promise to return the next day, his mind already racing with plans. He didn't know why he felt so compelled to help her, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't walk away, not now. The next morning, Alexander arrived at Margaret's house just as the sun was rising. He had spent the night thinking about how he could help her, and he came prepared. A team of contractors, cleaners, and landscapers followed him, ready to transform her home. But before they could start, Alexander wanted to make sure Margaret was comfortable with his plans. He knocked gently on the door, and after a moment, Margaret opened it, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of the bustling crew behind him. "Alexander, what's all this?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. "Good morning, Margaret," Alexander said with a warm smile. "I know your house means a lot to you, and I want to help restore it to its former glory. These people are here to fix the roof, paint the walls, clean up the garden, everything, but only if you're okay with it." Margaret stood frozen for a moment, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know what to say. This is too much. I can't possibly accept all this. Alexander stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. Margaret, you've spent your life caring for others. Now it's your turn to let someone care for you. Please let me do this for you. Margaret wiped her tears and nodded, her voice trembling. Thank you, Alexander. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't have to, Alexander replied. Seeing you happy is all the repayment I need. As the crew got to work, Alexander stayed by Margaret's side, making sure she was comfortable with every decision. They sat in her small kitchen, sipping tea and talking about her life, her memories, and her dreams. Alexander learned that Margaret had always wanted to travel but had never had the chance. She spoke wistfully of places she had read about in books: Paris, Venice, the Scottish Highlands. Maybe one day, Margaret said with a sigh, I'll get to see those places, even if it's just in my dreams. Alexander made a mental note of her words, a new idea forming in his mind. But for now, he focused on the present, on making her home a place of comfort and joy. By the end of the day, the transformation was astounding. The house gleamed with fresh paint, the roof was sturdy, and the garden was alive with color. Margaret walked through her home, her hands trembling as she touched the newly polished banister and the vibrant flowers in her garden. It's beautiful, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. It's like Thomas is here with me again. Alexander smiled, his heart swelling with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. I'm glad you're happy, Margaret. But this is just the beginning. Margaret turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. You've already done so much. What more could there be? Alexander's smile widened. You'll see. Over the next few days, Alexander became a regular presence in Margaret's life. He visited her every morning, bringing groceries, books, and sometimes just his company. The two had formed an unlikely bond, and Alexander found himself looking forward to their conversations. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond his business empire. One morning, as they sat in Margaret's newly renovated living room, Alexander handed her a small envelope. This is for you, he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Margaret looked at him curiously before opening the envelope. Inside was a plane ticket to Paris, along with a detailed itinerary for a 2-week trip. Her hands trembled as she stared at the ticket, her eyes filling with tears. Alexander, I can't accept this. It's too much. Alexander shook his head, his voice gentle but firm. Margaret, you've spent your entire life giving to others. Now it's your turn to experience the world. Paris is just the beginning. I've arranged for a private guide to show you around, and you'll be staying in a beautiful hotel overlooking the Seine. Please, say you'll go. Margaret's tears spilled over as she clutched the ticket to her chest. I don't know how to thank you. This is a dream come true. Alexander smiled, his heart swelling with joy. You don't have to thank me. Seeing you happy is all the thanks I need. The days leading up to Margaret's trip were filled with excitement and preparation. Alexander helped her pack, ensuring she had everything she needed for her journey. On the day of her departure, he drove her to the airport where a private escort was waiting to guide her through the process. As they stood at the terminal, Margaret turned to Alexander, her eyes filled with emotion. I don't know what I did to deserve your kindness, but I'll never forget it. You've given me a second chance at life, and I'll always be grateful. Alexander hugged her tightly, feeling a lump form in his throat. You deserve every bit of happiness, Margaret. Have the time of your life, and when you come back, we'll plan your next adventure. Margaret boarded the plane with a heart full of gratitude and excitement. As the plane took off, she looked out the window, marveling at the world below. For the first time in years, she felt alive, her spirit renewed by the kindness of a stranger who had become like family. Margaret's trip to Paris was nothing short of magical. She wandered the cobblestone streets, marveled at the Eiffel Tower, and savored croissants at quaint cafes. Every day was a new adventure, and she felt a sense of wonder she hadn't experienced in decades. Her private guide, a kind woman named Claire, became a dear friend, showing her the hidden gems of the city and sharing stories of its rich history. One evening, as Margaret sat by the Seine, watching the lights of the city reflect on the water, she felt a deep sense of peace. She realized that Alexander hadn't just given her a trip, he had given her a renewed sense of hope and joy. She made a promise to herself to live the rest of her life with gratitude and an open heart. When Margaret returned home, Alexander was there to greet her at the airport. She looked radiant, her eyes sparkling with newfound energy. "Welcome back," Alexander said, pulling her into a warm hug. "How was it?" "It was everything I dreamed of and more," Margaret replied, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you, Alexander. You've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to describe." Alexander smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I'm so glad you enjoyed it. But this is just the beginning. There's so much more I want to do for you." Over the next few months, Alexander continued to support Margaret in ways big and small. He helped her reconnect with her children who had been moved by her transformation and wanted to be a bigger part of her life. He also encouraged her to pursue her passions, whether it was painting, gardening, or volunteering at a local community center. Margaret's home became a hub of activity filled with laughter and love. Her children and grandchildren visited often, and she even started hosting weekly tea parties for her neighbors. She had become a beacon of kindness and resilience in her community, inspiring others with her story. One day, as Margaret and Alexander sat in her garden, surrounded by the vibrant flowers they had planted together, Margaret turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Alexander, I've been thinking. You've done so much for me, and I want to do something for you in return." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You don't have to do anything for me, Margaret. Seeing you happy is all I need." Margaret shook her head. "No, I want to give you something. I want to share my story, our story, with the world. Maybe it can inspire others to show kindness and compassion, just like you did for me." Alexander was touched by her words. "That's a beautiful idea, Margaret. Let's do it together." Margaret and Alexander worked together to share their story. They wrote a book titled The Power of a Single Act: How Kindness Transformed Two Lives, detailing their journey from strangers to family. The book became a bestseller, touching the hearts of readers around the world. People were inspired by Margaret's resilience and Alexander's transformation from a cold-hearted billionaire to a man who found meaning in helping others. The success of the book allowed them to start a foundation dedicated to helping elderly individuals who were struggling with loneliness and financial hardship. They named it the Thomas and Margaret Foundation, in honor of Margaret's late husband and the love that had brought them all together. The foundation provided housing, health care, and companionship to those in need, becoming a beacon of hope for countless people. As the years passed, Margaret and Alexander grew even closer. They traveled the world together, visiting the places Margaret had always dreamed of seeing. They laughed, shared stories, and created memories that would last a lifetime. Alexander, who had once been defined by his wealth and power, now found his greatest joy in the simple moments, sitting with Margaret in her garden, sipping tea and watching the sunset. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Margaret turned to Alexander with a soft smile. "You know, Alexander, I used to think my life was over after Thomas passed. But you showed me that there's still so much to live for. You gave me a second chance, and I'll always be grateful." Alexander took her hand, his eyes filled with emotion. "And you gave me a second chance too, Margaret. You showed me what it means to truly live, to love, and to make a difference. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Margaret squeezed his hand, her heart full. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Alexander nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "We have. And the best part is, our story isn't over yet." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the garden, Margaret and Alexander sat in comfortable silence, their hearts intertwined by a bond that had changed both of their lives forever. Their story was a testament to the power of human connection, the healing nature of kindness, and the beauty of second chances. And so, the billionaire who had once been lost in a world of wealth and power found his true purpose in helping a poor old lady sitting at her husband's grave. Together, they created a legacy of love that would inspire generations to come.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.